Okay, so we will begin the lecture for today. If I'm right, it's 2 p.m. Okay, so today is the final lecture for your 203 course. In the lecture today, I'll try to somewhat offer a reading of the two kind of final texts you will be looking at. So Faust, on one hand, the literary text that you will be looking at, as well as Hegel. Goethe's Faust and Hegel's philosophy emerge at exactly the same moment in history. So they share plenty of concerns that I'll try to highlight for you in today's lecture. So this final theme of the course is concerned with an intellectual movement that we could, or that has been called German idealism in specific, and of course with what we have termed for you, or what we have called this modernity beyond enlightenment in your selections. And so we are here somewhat dealing again with a moment of a break, of a rupture, one that was first signaled by the French Revolution of 1798. The German idealists, so the figures that you will be looking at during this section of the course, were writing roughly 17 years later from the French Revolution, and were somewhat the privileged observers of this historical break, of this historical moment. So Fichte, who was one of the foundational figures of this time, stated himself that the intellectual movement of German idealism was a byproduct of the French Revolution. So the texts that we are looking at this week come out of somewhat an incredible condensation in the history of thought, a moment in which we see the dawn of modernity, somewhat an end and a beginning, a watershed, a break, a rupture. Think of Hamlet already telling us that time is out of joint in the text that you have looked at already, Shakespeare's Hamlet. Kant, who you have looked at already in the selections on enlightenment, had declared already that philosophy had not somewhat existed prior to his critique of pure reason, which he wrote in 1781. And I quote from Kant, the first quote on the PowerPoint: "It sounds arrogant, self-seeking, and for those who have not yet relinquished their old system, belittling to assert that prior to the development of critical philosophy, there had been no philosophy at all." End of quote. This is Kant. As though that were not enough, Kant had concluded in his critique of pure reason, with which philosophy is supposed to have begun, by predicting that the completion of philosophy was now imminent. And to quote from Kant, "It may be possible to achieve before the end of the century what many centuries have not yet been able to accomplish." End of quote. So in less than 19 years, this is Kant's claim. Now, this is only to be followed by Hegel, who announced, in his own works, the end of philosophy, the end of the history of philosophy. And this is the last quote, Hegel's claim: "Herewith this history of philosophy comes to an end," in 1806. So why do I begin with this? Because to show that this kind of concern with ends and beginnings was fundamental within these crucial 25 years of philosophy. And it was the evidence of what one could call the pathos of a historical moment. The revolutionary calendar, which was instilled by the French Revolution, had introduced the beginning of a new count, a break that is of what one could call world historical magnitude, and one which introduced for Hegel the coming of absolute knowledge, as he called it. Yeah, you guys are too close for talking. If you want to do that, could you move to the end or kindly leave? Yeah. Okay, so this concern with ends and beginnings within these crucial 25 years of philosophy was evidence of the pathos of the historical moment. The revolutionary calendar had introduced the beginning of a new count, a break, as I say, of world historical magnitude, and one which introduced for Hegel what he would call the coming of absolute knowledge. This is Hegel's term. This absolute knowledge, however, could only be attained for Hegel by a complete insertion or a full insertion in the historical moment. And this is a fundamental contribution that Hegel brings forth, this kind of injecting philosophy with history, okay? In the preface of his Phenomenology, which is a text that you will be reading selections from this week, Hegel characterizes his age as a period of transition, a birth of a new age. So the movement of history for Hegel will come to be something that is inseparable from that of what he would call spirit, roughly defined for us as kind of a supra-individual entity, culture, human culture, let's say. One that is never in a state of rest for Hegel. And one that, this is Hegel's fundamental question, one that Hegel sought to rediscover the path by which it had reacted or come to be in its historical present. And this is Hegel here in his commentary from the Phenomenology. It is here as in the case of a birth of a child. After a long period of nutrition and silence, the continuity of the gradual growth in size of quantitative change is suddenly cut short by the first breath of dawn. There is a break in the process, a qualitative change, and the child is born. In like manner, the spirit of the time, this is Hegel's interest, the spirit of the time growing slowly and quietly ripe for the new form it is to assume, disintegrates one fragment after another of the structure of its previous world. That it is tottering to its fall is only indicated by symptoms here and there. This gradual crumbling to pieces, which did not alter the general look and aspect of the whole, is interrupted by the sunrise, which in a flash and at a single stroke brings to view the form and structure of the new world. This is Hegel. So, in a sense, Hegel's interest is with this question of spirit is that it can only be understood, or it can only be what it is through its own history. And the task of philosophy is somewhat to bring this question of history to fore. Now, the oldest systematic program of 1797, which is, again, one of the texts that you will be looking at this week, is a very curious and foundational text for the German idealists. And it expresses, again, the spirit of the time. It is co-authored by Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, who were all roommates at Tübingen, at the university there. Hegel himself was born on the 27th of August in 1770. He was the first child of a minor financial official, of basically a civil bureaucrat, who very much opposed the change of the time. Hegel was a kind of the son, the unwanted child of a bureaucrat, in a sense, and we'll see why. So he was the first child of a minor bureaucrat, and as a schoolboy, he read widely in the works of both classical and modern authors, including Homer, Sophocles, Euripides, Shakespeare, Goethe, and Schiller. In October 1788, Hegel matriculated at the University of Tübingen to study theology, and during his 5 years there became friends with Friedrich Hölderlin, his exact contemporary, and Friedrich von Schelling, who was 4.5 years his junior. While in Tübingen, Hegel's notes and studies show that he had a very thorough knowledge of the chief figures of the French Enlightenment: Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, and others. He had also read Hume's History of England, Gibbon's Decline and the Fall of the Roman Empire, as well as Schiller's historical writings. He also read essays by Benjamin Constant and the works of the German revolutionary George Foster. So the three friends, Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, shared an enthusiasm for Plato, for Lessing, for Rousseau, and for Spinoza's philosophy as it was portrayed in Jacobi's letters on the doctrine of Spinoza. And especially, they shared an enthusiasm for the two great revolutions of the time. The political revolution started in France in 1789, and the intellectual revolution inaugurated in Germany in the early 1780s by the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. So their focus of attention at the time was particularly Kant's moral philosophy and the philosophy of religion. And Hegel, in his early years, in these years where this older system program that you will be looking at was written, was very much interested in questions that have to do with social reality, with the possibility of transforming social reality by man himself. Because Hegel was, although he was a philosopher of the idea or an idealist, For him, the ideal realm and the everyday world are not to be separated, but are to be thought together in what one could call an organic totality. So for Hegel, the various moments of life of spirit, as we said, culture, human culture broadly defined, so these various moments of human spirit or human culture or spirit, such as labor, the machine, things he wrote about, the family, language, and the law, constitute somewhat the determinate aspects of life in a society. So in other words, they have to be thought together, all together as an organic totality. And so in a sense, the life of a people for Hegel does not achieve its reflection by itself. It does not reflect by itself on itself, nor does the conscious life of spirit, the conscious life of culture, simply somewhat transcend and change the living reality. A true awakening of consciousness, for Hegel, introduces somewhat an anxiety, an instability into the heart of our immediate kind of intuition of things. So for Hegel, if we simply rely on intuition, on this kind of immediate presentation of particulars, of somewhat particular, or what you would call a thing, unique thing in space and time, if we simply rely on this form of intuition for Hegel, this means that spirit is completely absorbed in its object. It becomes, if it relies simply on intuition, it relies on a faculty that's powerless, that's not dynamic. That is why for Hegel he places what he calls the concept before intuition, the concept before history. So the concept of life needs to be thought before we think life itself. Okay, this is somewhat the development of consciousness needs to be considered in its historical process. So for Hegel, in his early years, being a philosopher of the idea and also maintaining this link between the ideal and the everyday world, this was fundamental for him, thinking about the social praxis or the transformation of social reality by man himself. After all, Hegel was a philosopher who wrote, the reading of the daily newspaper is the morning prayer of the modern man. This is his statement. In other words, it enables us to take somewhat a stand in the world and become conscious of the historical situation within which we are in. Of course, Hegel was in no way somewhat a revolutionary, but very much a reformer. So, for instance, in 1795, Hegel wrote in a letter to Schelling a critique of the small state of Bern where he had lived or where he was living, to expose what he said kind of behind the virtuous facade of society, all the injustices that must be swept away and can only be realized by proposing or bringing forth a new ideal or a new idea. And so, in a sense, Hegel had this kind of very strange belief in the liberating power of ideas, okay, something that you already see beginning to be proposed in the Enlightenment in general. Now, as a theology student in Tübingen, Hegel came into contact with the religious minds of his age, with Schiller and Lessing. And the question of freedom was the background for his concern with religion, or with thinking about religion. In his early theological writings, Hegel wrote critically about the Christian religion and the state, and this is also something you will see in the Oldest System program. He used this concept that him and Schiller had proposed as a translation of the French Rights of Man, which was man's dignity for Hegel. Man's dignity, and I quote him, consists in refusing to revere the statutes of the church or to obey the laws of the state, end of quote. This is from Hegel. So in his philosophy of history, Hegel saw that the collapse of city-states in antiquity and the rise of Christianity meant the disappearance of a society of human freedom and greatness, and the transformation of a heroic kind of citoyen or citizen of the polis to a bourgeois, egoistic individual. So the question that he was, in this early moment in the text that you will look at, the question that he was concerned with is how to return from a religion of despotism and enslavement to a religion of freedom on the model of antiquity. So this is a question that early Hegel would ask. Which means that the understanding of religion for Hegel is necessary in a sense, for understanding what is, or the conditions of what is, because religion is above all a representation of collective life, a symbolic projection of concrete human problems in Hegel's understanding. And this is a quote from Hegel: "The state can only induce its citizens to make use of these institutions by inspiring confidence in them," the institutions of the state. "Religion is the preeminent instrument of this purpose, and whether or not it can fulfill this task depends on the use made of it by the state. This purpose is clearly in evidence in the religions of all people," end of quote. So in Tübingen, Hölderlin, Schelling, and Hegel were frustrated by the artificiality of politics and religion in their society, and they hoped to see the neighboring revolution promote necessary radical change in their own context, in their own society, the neighboring revolution in France. In one of his notebooks, next to scribbles that read "Death to the Tyrants," this is Hegel, Hegel described the ideal he shared with Hölderlin and Schelling to be that of reason and liberty. So the task of modern philosophy for Hegel was this furthering of the task of enlightenment. The problem that you will see in the oldest systematic program is that enlightenment clearly cannot win over the kind of enjoyments provided by folk religion, what folk religion gives people. So it will constantly fail against folk religion. Thus, Hegel proposes in this early text, we need somewhat a mythology of reason that has to be constructed through a specific kind of philosophy, the philosophy of the idea for Hegel, a philosophy of what ought to be, by opposing what ought to be to what is. So in this sense, the task of philosophy, or this kind of the creation of this mythology of reason, is to awaken the minds that have been simply trapped in the present. In a letter to Schelling dated April 16, 1795, Hegel wrote, and this is on the PowerPoint, "By revealing how everything will be, how everything ought to be, it will sweep away this new philosophy, the indolence of those who confer eternity upon everything as it is." So what ought to be for the early Hegel is a subjective public religion, as a religion of self-liberation of the people versus what he would call an objective religion, a religion codified in laws for Hegel is dead. A religion codified in the law for Hegel is dead. And again, to quote from him, "Memory is the gallows on which the Greek gods have hanged. Memory is the grave, the repository of the dead. The dead dwell in it as dead matter. They are exhibited there like a collection of stones," end of quote. So this is, again, Hegel's insistence on kind of like injecting history into thought. So in a sense, this is the driving thrust of the oldest systematic program, the project of creating a mythology of reason by which everything is judged by its idea, and where the critique of the state in this early text begins from specifying that the state is not an idea. It does not gain the status of an idea. This is again from the oldest system program. So moving from this kind of critique of the state, the author, whoever it is between the three, it's not clear, writes, "From nature I come to the works of man. Guided by the idea of humanity, I intend to show that there can be no idea of the state, since the state is mechanical, just as there can be no such thing as the idea of a machine. Only that which is free can be called an idea. We must therefore transcend the state, for every state must treat free men as cogs in a machine, and this must be prevented. Hence the state must cease to exist," end of quote. So from here on, the three authors, Hölderlin, Schelling, and Hegel, set out, kind of move on to set out the principles for a history of mankind, and to expose the entire wretched hodgepodge of the state, constitution, government, and legislature. And this is followed by ideas that they propose about morality and religion. Again, a quote from the text: "The destruction of all false gods, the persecution of the priesthood, with their new hypocritical adoption of reason, all this to be brought by reason itself. The absolute freedom of all spirits who bear the intellectual world within themselves and who may not seek either God or immortality outside of themselves," end of quote. So despite it not being clear who of the three who had indeed authored this text that you will be looking at, Hegel very much differed from Schelling and Hölderlin by his more historical approach. So the destruction of the state in his other writings cannot be taken account of except cannot be considered except by taking account of the dialectical historical development of objective reality. So the Ancien Régime, or the pre-French Revolutionary regime, for Hegel was upheld by a distinction between what he called a noble consciousness and a base consciousness, which you will look at in the master and slave or the lord and bondsman selection. The problem was that the nobility that was once consecrated for the service of the state was now in the service of money, so in the service of money or wealth and not honor. So the nobility rejects the impurity of action for Hegel. Like the master and the master-slave dialectic, it lacks the force to, what you will see in the text, externalize itself. It now takes offense and is humiliated by culture surrounding it. This humiliation and disgust is, for Hegel, kind of a form of a pre-revolutionary consciousness, a pre-revolutionary mentality. And in it, the distinction between noble and base consciousness becomes merely formal. Wealth is measured in terms of immediate satisfaction, which results in the depravity of the soul of the rich, as well as their clients. So in a sense, this integrated consciousness, that, as Hegel calls it, is a result of a pre-revolutionary, unhappy consciousness. And the honest philosopher is somewhat speechless in the face of this disintegrated soul of the Ancien Regime. And Hegel writes this commentary also by discussing an interesting text translated by Goethe himself, by Diderot, called Rameau's Nephew, where you have this kind of bohemian figure being in conversation with a philosopher in order for a kind of comical staging of pre-revolutionary consciousness. I mean, think here in terms of the bohemian who figure that, or this kind of figure of pre-revolutionary consciousness who is humiliated by culture surrounding it. Think of the modern day hipster, for example. This is a kind of pre-revolutionary, unhappy consciousness. So Hegel claims that the solution to the situation of disintegrated consciousness is, to quote on the slide, a return of the whole onto itself. This return can only involve the spirit of culture itself, to quote, and can only mean that it must, qua spirit, return out of its confusion into itself and win for itself a higher level of conscious life. So consciousness in Hegel's understanding is this identity of thought with itself only in its disintegration. It is only self-consciousness, or it can only be self-consciousness that comprehends everything within itself and becomes in its universality and absolute liberty and an absolute freedom. Spirit is time, Hegel wrote in his Jena writings, for it is only in the temporality of consciousness that the whole, to quote, the quote is in the PowerPoint, the third one, the whole which develops itself resolves its own development, and in this movement simply preserves itself and can be present to itself. So spirit is history, a history oriented to the future because it is an absolute principle of negativity for Hegel. Spirit for Hegel is the consciousness of life, or the consciousness of life, however, is not to be reduced to life itself. It's not to be reduced to life. There's a difference between the consciousness of life and life itself. Self-consciousness for Hegel only emerges with a break from naive immediate life, and this existence of self-consciousness emerges somewhat from the womb of the world as a negation of every particular form of being. Further, to become conscious of life is to reflect upon death for Hegel, or to exist in the face of death itself. And this is something that Faust and Mephistopheles will somewhat play out in Goethe's text. So in 1801, Hegel left Frankfurt to join Schelling in Jena, which not long before had been home to both Fichte and the circle of romantics around Friedrich Schlegel. And in 1807, Hegel published the work which marks the beginning of his philosophical maturity, The Phenomenology of Spirit. In this work, from which you will be reading an extract, The Lord and the Bondsman, Hegel radically departs from his early work and from everything Schelling or Fichte had attempted before. In The Phenomenology, he provides an account of the development of consciousness from the standpoint of kind of immediate sense certainty to the standpoint of absolute knowing or philosophy itself. So for Hegel, who, as we have said, was an avid enthusiast when in Tübingen for the French Revolution, he was skeptical still about this naive enthusiasm for change for the sake of change and of the disparaging opposition to change. He saw the need for discovering or rediscovering the path through which the human spirit had reached its historical present in terms of its past development. So spirit is what it is only through, for Hegel, what it has already come to be, through its own history. So in order to retread this path, Hegel would attempt the massive feat of relating the singular and the universal, or as he puts it, to think life itself. So the concept of life here was a very important one for the German Romantics. Herder, Goethe, Schelling all used a kind of a Spinozan language to reconcile nature, to think of nature as this kind of infinite productivity with matter, with a conditional and limited product. Concepts like world soul were proposed for this reconciliation, in which matter, force, and spirit are united. And we see this idea resonate in Goethe, for example. In Goethe's Faust, we see this idea of life as what is posited against kind of moribund speculation or speculations about death. Instead of living nature, this is Goethe's Faust, in which God created man, you're surrounded by smoke and rot, animals, skeletons, and dead men's bones. So in a sense, Goethe here is very much on the side of the Romantics in many ways, while Hegel understood, unlike the Romantics, posited a certain distinction between life and the consciousness of life. Living thought, or the thought of human life, can only occur by a certain departure from nature. It is not an intuition of nature, but a development of consciousness for Hegel. So he does not share these kind of like cosmic sympathies of Schelling, for instance. For Hegel, nature is an inferior moment of what he calls the idea. It is not a complete manifestation of the absolute. For him, the spirit of nature, as the second quote on the PowerPoint, does not develop itself in the same form as spirit. It is only spirit for the spirit who is conscious of it. It is spirit in itself, but not for itself. Thus, spirit for Hegel is that which discovers itself, and nature is only a scene for that discovery. Nature's spirit remains hidden. So while the Romantics considered the notion of life as a totality, we see from Faust again the question that Goethe is very much posing like the Romantics, or in line with the Romantics: eternal nature, where shall I grasp you? Where are you, breasts, you springs of life, on which hang heaven and earth? Toward which the parched heart presses. You flow, you suckle, must I do without you? This is Faust. So while the Romantics debated nature in terms of its infinite productivity, Hegel did not agree with the Romantic proposition of some unknowable world soul, a unity or identity from which everything flows and to which everything flows. Rather, for Hegel, contradiction and opposition are absolutes. He proposed this kind of dialectical mode of thought that is premised on opposition and contradiction as absolute. There is no infinite beyond knowledge for Hegel. The absolute is not a unity or an identity. It's not a unity or an identity with nature, but is a negative power, an entity or an activity that posits division and contradiction in itself in order to negate it. So Hegel's path towards his later conception of spirit as a unity in difference is clearly opened up by his famous and much quoted claim that life is the union of union and disunion. So life for Hegel does not exclude opposition, therefore, but rather includes death, opposition and understanding within itself. So again, this is what you can think of Hamlet's to be or not to be, as in to be and not to be simultaneously. This life and death, there is no life without its opposition, without death itself. And this is, okay, I keep this quote, I think for the lack of time. Again, there's this quote from Hegel. You can go back and see it if you look at the PowerPoint that will be uploaded on the website. So how does this bring us to Goethe? How does this bring us to Faust? In Goethe's Faust, we see how this kind of Hegelian principle of negativity, of opposition, of contradiction, is embodied in, let's say, the figure of Mephistopheles, who is necessary, who seems to be a necessary figure for consciousness to unfold, for Faust, as kind of like Faust's for what occurs to Faust to unfold. So this unfolding of consciousness is not simply about the unfolding of Faust's own individual self, but one that stands in for the movement of thought itself. So you can think of Mephistopheles and Faust as this kind of staging of the movement of thought itself as it is considered somewhat in Hegel's philosophy. So in a sense, we see staged between Faust and Mephistopheles negation as this kind of logical operator that creates a subject. So what does Mephistopheles say as soon as he is encountered by Faust, when Faust says to him, "Who are you?" Mephistopheles says, "I am the spirit of perpetual negation, and rightly so, for all things that exist deserve to perish and would not be missed. Much better it would be if nothing were brought in being. Thus, what you men call destruction, sin, evil, in short, is all my sphere, the element I most prefer." This is Mephistopheles. So what does Faust say? "You seem complete and whole, yet you say you are part." Mephistopheles, "I speak the modest truth. I use no art. Let foolish little human souls delude themselves that they are wholes. I am part of that part which once, when all began, was all there was, part of darkness before man, whence light was born, proud light, which now makes futile war, to wrest from night, its mother, what before was hers, her ancient place in space. For light depends on the corporeal worlds, matter that sends visible light out, stops light in its stride, and by reflected light is beautified. So light will not last long, I fear. Matter shall be destroyed, and light shall disappear." So Faust, in his introduction to Mephistopheles, is somewhat introduced to this element of negation. Again, Mephistopheles, the something, this coarse world, this mess, stands in the way of nothingness. Faust, and so ever steering wholesome energy of life is your arch enemy. So in there, this is an interesting connection that can perhaps be made between the text you were looking at from Hegel and Faust. And in fact, in their letter exchanges, which amounted up to 10 letters, between Hegel and Goethe, Hegel said to Goethe that Goethe's writings were ever present in all his philosophical works. So it is no wonder that in one of his letters to Goethe in 1825, Hegel says, and I quote, "When I survey my intellectual development, I find you everywhere interwoven therein," end of quote. So concomitant to Hegel's project and what it reveals about philosophy at the dawn of modernity, as we said, that this kind of age of this watershed, this beginning and end, this moment of historical rupture, time is out of joint, in Hamlet's words. Concomitant to Hegel's project, we have Goethe's Faust, who poses a parallel question. So for Hegel, he's enacting kind of like the end of the history of philosophy, this coming of absolute knowledge in this moment, while for Goethe, what is being enacted is the situation of art in modernity. So you have this kind of interesting link that you can make between philosophy and art. For Goethe, the experience of art in its fullness in modernity is no longer accessible to us. Art now makes a claim on us in terms of our historical consciousness, similar to what philosophy does for Hegel. So as Hegel himself also puts it on his lectures on art, where he also somewhat declares the end of art, to quote from Hegel, "No matter how beautiful we find a statue, our knee no longer bends before it." This is in modernity. No matter how beautiful we find a statue, our knee no longer bends before it. So the path to the reconstitution of philosophy for Hegel as art in Goethe's Faust must come with the recognition that human life is historical through and through. In his lectures on tragedy, for example, Hegel sees Faust as an absolutely philosophical tragedy, showing the tragic quest for harmony between the absolute, and the individual's knowledge and will, between the universal and the particular. So Hegel characterized the difference between Greek tragedies and modern tragedies as this difference introduced by the principle of subjectivity, and this is his commentary on Faust. In modern tragedy, it is generally the case that individuals do not act for the sake of the substantial nature of their end, nor is it that nature which proves to be their motive and their passion. On the contrary, what presses for satisfaction is the subjectivity of their heart and mind and the privacy of their own character, end of quote. And he says of Faust, Goethe's Faust, the absolute philosophical tragedy, is here on the one side dissatisfaction with learning, for Faust, as you will see, and on the other, the freshness of life and enjoyment in the world. In general, the tragic quest for harmony between the absolute in its essence and appearance and the individual's knowledge and will. All this provides a breadth of subject matter which no other dramatist has ventured to compass in one and the same work. End of quote. This is Hegel on Goethe. So in a sense, Faust is arguably this kind of Hegelian subject, precisely because he treads through the path of negativity. He makes a pact with the devil. This is how he begins. He makes a pact with Mephistopheles. He's an example of a subjectivity achieving an awareness of its autonomy by recognizing the supramundane God and the structure of consciousness to which he owes his existence. In a sense, Goethe dramatizes Hegel's path towards self-consciousness. Faust stages this link between maturation and enlightenment, which is not a question, again, of individual life, but a question of spirit, in the sense of the development of humanity itself towards maturation and progressive emancipation. So enlightenment. The tragedy then asks, how are these two structures interwoven? How is progressive emancipation and maturation interwoven with individual life and the development of humanity? So Faust, in his reflexive stance towards experience, ends up providing us with somewhat, when you look at the text, or if you've already begun reading it, with a kind of a cultural archive, a historical consciousness. Goethe's Faust can be, in a sense, compared as well to an encyclopedia. He is an encyclopedic figure of sorts by which the experience of all humanity is staged. He treads the path of enlightenment, which in its core was the project of unfolding the inner structure of knowledge, to map knowledge in all its manifestations, the project of the knowledge of knowledge, and then of absolute knowledge with Hegel. So like the projects of Hegel and Novalis and Diderot and d'Alembert, Goethe's Faust is an encyclopedia of European cultural memory. You know, as you see the figures that emerge in the text, Helen of Troy, military exploits, colonial rule, social and utopian community of free individuals, born all from Mephistopheles, from nothingness, from negation, directed to an open future. So the modern subject, Faust, tells us, as does Hegel, that the modern subject is only motivated somewhat by two things, by knowledge and by desire, right? Because Mephistopheles is this kind of, he's seducing Faust with pleasures and enjoyments. So the modern subject is motivated by two things, by knowledge and desire, with a disregard to all traditional codes. Faust's pact with the devil, his necromancy, or his wager on the devil, is in a sense a wager on negativity. This is a very modern kind of wager, a wager that you will not find in ancient tragedies. Okay? So the power of the negative, in a sense, is an absolute power for Hegel, as it is for Goethe's Faust. His development and fulfillment, implicitly his very death, his development and fulfillment are implicitly his very death. The growth of the individual as a living being is by means of his own negation and maturation simultaneously. So Hegel maintained that the living being, in positing himself, negates himself. It is, to quote from Hegel, just as much a formation of independent individual shapes as it is a way of canceling a shape assumed. This is maturation. The life of the child is the death of the parent. In this cycle of life, the universal and the individual interpenetrate. As a totality, life can be conceptualized by transcending, overcoming these differentiations, but it also presupposes separate structures. And the engine of this process is the power of negativity. So the individual life form has to negate itself. Think of Faust's wager with Mephistopheles. And then it has to negate its own negation. It has to lose. So Faust has to lose his wager. This is in Faust 2 that you don't read, but in Faust 2, he loses his wager with Mephistopheles. So he begins with negating himself, or his wager. Then the wager is lost. You have this kind of negation of the negation in order to somewhat return to a totality. And this is fundamentally the development of consciousness for Hegel and the dialectic of the absolute spirit in his philosophy. So now, as we have seen, the task of philosophy for Hegel is not to be a philosophy of nature, but to be a philosophy of the life of consciousness. It denounces all that is dead in the living body of spirit. Consciousness is not a consciousness of nature, but a relation between two self-consciousnesses. man and man, individual and society, master and slave, or what you would call, for those of you in the social sciences or the humanities, intersubjectivity, okay? But not specifically so, but we can say that here. So in the Phenomenology in the Lord and the Bondsman section, which you will be reading this week, we see this dialectic of recognition as it unfolds between two self-consciousnesses, the master and the slave. And through this dialectic of recognition, there's an immediate change of relations of domination and servitude. The master becomes an instrument of his own enslavement, while the slave becomes a master of the master through his labor. And what the slave ultimately fears the most is the death of the master. So I cannot go much more into this here, but in the Lords and Bondsmen section, Hegel introduces for us this dialectic of recognition that is premised on desire, the desire to be recognized by the other. So the struggle to death, in a sense, as you will see in the master and slave dialectic, as you see in, between Faust and Mephistopheles, the struggle to death is somewhat the condition of history. Each seeks the death of the other, this kind of struggle between two self-consciousnesses, and demands to be recognized by the other as a pure being for itself, realized as absolute negativity, beyond merely a simple organism or a living object. So human self-consciousness is premised in the first place on desire, a desire that is never satisfied. Man desires to live, but life in him appears at once as something identical and alien to him. Think of Hamlet, again, time is out of joint. Better not to be. I wish I was not born to set it right, right? Again, think of Faust. So consciousness of life is premised on this deremption, on a disjunction, on a break, that is put into play by the negative principle of this desire for recognition or desire. So what does the Lord say to Mephistopheles in the prologue? You are a type, this is God speaking to Mephistopheles, to the devil, to his other. You are a type I never learned to hate, among the spirits who negate. The ironic scold offends me least of all. Man is too apt to sink into pure satisfaction. A total standstill is his constant wish. Therefore, your company, busily devilish, serves well to stimulate him into action. This is the Lord speaking to Mephistopheles. So this, what Mephistopheles introduces in a sense for Faust is again this kind of question of desire, right? So Hegel introduces desire or deduces it from the concept of life, not as a biological life, but as what includes both subjects and objects, the inanimate and the animate. It is what is maintained with the passing of all entities which are caught in its circle. If life can only survive death as a universal, desire then must not be a life function. So the struggle is not for survival between the slave and the master, but it is about the willingness to put more at stake than one's mere survival. The slave wants life over liberty, and hence must labor endlessly, become a mere consciousness of thinghood, as Hegel puts it, while the master is a master over one who has squandered away the status of subject, the master over nothing. So a master of someone who is not worthy to provide recognition. This is what you will see played out in the master-slave dialectic. So from this struggle, what emerges is death as the absolute principle of negativity through which human history is generated. It is a freedom somewhat for Hegel, or absolute freedom as a freedom towards death. So the true life of spirit is not one who recoils from death or becomes conscious of it, but in one who internalizes death. To quote from Hegel, it is the magic power that converts the negative into being, death. So this is the Hegelian understanding, again, of the subject, that which contains human history, not limited to any particular being. Thus, who is Faust in Goethe's tragedy, if not this coming into being of a subject? Again, this is from Faust. I don't know where it is. Well, okay, I'll just read it for you. If I ever lie down in sloth and base inaction, then let that moment be my end. I'll be your false cajolery. You lull me into self-sufficiency. It any pleasure you can give deludes me. Let me cease to live. I offer you this wager. This is the scene of the wager between Faust and Mephistopheles. So there's an exchange of knowledge for pleasure in the wager. Faust gives up his knowledge in return for pleasure. What does Faust say again? I tell you, the mere pleasure is not the point. To dizzying, painful joy I dedicate myself to refreshing frustration, loving hate. I've purged the lust for knowledge from my soul. Now the full range of suffering you shall face. Now my inner self I will embrace, the experience allotted to the whole. Race of mankind, my mind shall grasp the heights and depths. My heart know all their sorrows and delights. This is why I'm saying Faust is not the individual here. It's this kind of staging, the unfolding of this question of spirit, of human consciousness. So the experience allotted to the whole, this is what Faust will embrace. The whole race of mankind, my mind shall grasp the heights and depths. My heart know all their sorrows and delights. Thus I will expand myself, and their self I shall be, and perish in the end, like all humanity. So the structure of the wager, again, the scene of the wager between Faust and Mephistopheles, can be read through Hegel. God dies in man, while man raises himself to the divine, to the absolute, through a history that is his judge. So I want to go back to the oldest system program in order to conclude the lecture, and your suffering will be over very soon. So like Faust's story rehearses all the stages of classical mythology in order for him to be the mythic figure of modernity, the subject of history, Hegel in the oldest systematic program makes a similar claim. Enlightened philosophy, the enlightenment of Kant, the exit from conditions of immaturity, doesn't have the heart and fantasy that the previous religion possessed. Reason has to return to its mythology of reason. So this is, again, the final quote in the lecture. Until we make ideas aesthetic, i.e. mythological, they should hold no interest for the people. And conversely, before mythology is reasonable, the philosopher must be ashamed of it. Thus, finally, the enlightened and unenlightened must shake hands. Mythology must become philosophical, and the people reasonable. And philosophy must become mythological in order to make philosophy sensual. Then external unity will reign among us. Never again the contemptuous glance, never the blind trembling of the people before its wise men and priests. Only then does equal development of all powers await us, of the individual as well as of all individuals. No power will be suppressed any longer. Then general freedom and equality of spirits will reign. A higher spirit sent from heaven must establish this religion among us. It will be the last work of the human race, not the work of heaven. Okay? All right, so I end here. Thank you.